We're now going to build a function that gets data for us. This data can be internal or external. Let's set up our function and arguments. Here, you will notice that all our arguments are optional, and we'll see why. Along with making them optional, I added default values to most of them by using the equal sign and then some sort of scalar value, either string or numerical. First, we can supply a workbook path as a string. Next, we have the workbook argument. So if we don't want to pass it a path, we can just pass it a workbook object. We then have worksheet name argument that will be a string. This will be important if we have multiple worksheets in a workbook we are trying to get data from. Next, we have start row and start column. This will be for when our data set doesn't start in cell A1 or row 1, column 1. Finally, we have end row and end column. We will want these if we want our data scrape to end on a particular row or column. First, in our function logic, we need to deal with the workbook path and workbook object arguments. Mainly, what happens when one is supplied, or both are supplied, or none are supplied. We created an if statement, and the first line we check is if workbook path is supplied. If it is, then we will use it and set the workbook equal to workbooks.open and then the path. This means if the workbook and workbook path arguments are both supplied, then we are using the workbook path. If workbook path isn't supplied, then we check if the workbook argument is nothing. We use the is nothing keywords because workbook is an object. If the workbook argument is nothing, then we will set it to active workbook. If it is not is nothing, then the workbook will just equal the workbook supplied. Let's move to our worksheet argument. We just need to check if the worksheet argument was passed. Here we set WS equal to type worksheet. We then check if the worksheet name argument is empty. If it is not empty, then we set WS equal to the worksheet supplied by using w.sheets. If it is empty, then we set WS equal to the active worksheet. Let's code the column count logic. Actual count will be easy. We just need to make sure we account for the end column argument. We create a variable called call count. We then check if the end column argument is equal to 0. If it is, then we just pass the function we built in the last video. Now you'll notice I put start row. Remember, the start row's default is 1, but if someone passes a different number, then our column count row will update. If end column is not equal to 0, then we just set call count equal to the end column argument. Now let's move to row count. As we discussed in the row count videos, we are going to want to check all the columns' row count just in case we have a blank in the first column. Before, we picked an arbitrary number of columns to check, but since we have the column count, we will use that. First, let's code the if statement. Just like with column count, we create a variable row count. Then we check if the end row is 0. The logic if it equals 0 we will code in just a second. If it isn't 0, then we will set the row count to the end row. Now let's code the logic if end row equals 0. We first create our counter variable, and then we set our for loop to start at start column and go to column count. Now the start column default is 1, but like start row, if that changes, then our loop will update. We create temp row and then set it to the logic we created in the row count video. But we check each column by providing the counter variable to the column argument in the cells property. We then check to see if temp row is greater than row count. And this is a common pattern you will see, where you check a value against another and then update the value if it's greater than or less than. For us, we want max row count. So we are checking to see if temp row is greater than our row count, and row count keeps getting updated with each iteration of the loop. Now it's time to get the data, and we do this by selecting the range in our worksheet. All right, I am returning a range. Now you will first see I only did a worksheet, and in our last section we discussed fully referencing it. While it doesn't look like it, the workbook is being referenced. But since I did it when I assigned the worksheet, I don't need to put it down here. I'm using the cell property, and I'm providing all the arguments and variables that make up the data in the given workbook. This line of code is saying start in the cell of the starting row and starting column variable, and go to my row count and column count, and then return the data. Okay, one more code snippet. Here we want to close the workbook if a workbook path was provided. You may ask, what if a workbook was provided? Well, my assumption here is that in order to provide a workbook object, you have to have a workbook open. So it's more likely that you want to keep that workbook open than close it. For a path, the workbook is assumed to be closed, so you will want to automatically close it after you get the data. Now, this is up to you if you want to stick with that assumption or change it around. Let's now go test the function. I'm going to grab dataset 1, and I'm going to pass that into our getData function. First, we created our DataFrame variable. Then we set it equal to getData. We then have debug.print the ubounds of the return data frame. These should look familiar as we use them in our loops, but we don't just have to use them in our loops. They just return a value. So this is a nice way to know the boundaries of our data frame. Let's run it. And looking at it, those are the dimensions we expected. And if we go look at our data set, we can see we have 5 columns and 12 rows. All right, that wraps it up for this video. And now we have a way to get our data. And the nice thing about this function is that it returns a 2D array that we will be working with for the rest of the class.